Yeah, excellent work. Yeah. They got these fucked up police. Well, none of these motherfuckers out here this morning when Trump supporters was tearing that wall down and fucking us up. But now they want to come out here while black people out here to do the shit they do. White supremacy telling them to fuck us up. Those white bosses saying, go get those black people. Trump supporters did all the fuck they wanted to do this morning. Fuck the police, they don't keep us safe. We keep us safe, motherfuckers.
We keep us safe.
Who keep us safe?
We keep us safe.
Who keep us safe?
We keep us safe.
I cannot hear anything. Who keeps us safe?
We keep us safe.
Welcome, everybody, to the Friday edition of Burn It Down with Kim Brown. Striking video there from the streets of Washington, D.C. this past weekend as the Klan came to town. Oh, they weren't the Klan? Well, they kind of look like the Klan to me, or at least the grandchildren of the Klan. Trump supporters, white supremacists, the Proud Boys, whatever you want to call them, took to the streets of D.C. last weekend to show their support for the president who is trying to steal the election in a soft coup, which is still very much ongoing. But the striking difference is that Black Lives Matter activists have been in the streets of the District of Columbia all summer long, and they have been met with tear gas, with rubber bullets, with police violence. But Trump supporters come to town, tear shit up in the city, start fights, provoke incidents, and they get a warm welcome from Metropolitan Police. That treatment from police is extremely striking, and we're going to discuss that on today's program. I'm so excited for today's show. We have a great panel in store for you today. Also on today's show, it's Transgender Day of Remembrance. This week has been Transgender Awareness Week, and on Friday, today, is a day of remembrance for the trans people who have been murdered, not only across the world, but especially in this country, and specifically Black trans people who are targeted for sexual violence, for murder, for everything nefarious to humanity, is what this group and this community deals with. So we are going to pay homage and pay tribute to the trans people who have been murdered, at least some of them. We're going to say their names today. They are more than just a number. So listen, if you are watching today, right now, do me a favor, head on over to the Burn It Down with Kim Brown YouTube channel, like and subscribe there, because we have to get those subscriptions up so we can do our own thing over there. The Real News is very gracious to host us on their channel, but we want to get our own thing together. So y'all go on over there when you get a chance and hit subscribe for your homie. I certainly appreciate it. But now, time to bring in our panel. I'm so very excited. Two people I know, two people I don't know, but the people I don't know, I've been following their work, so I kind of feel like I know them, but I don't really know them, but I'm a big admirer. Huh? Okay, well, Taya said she's not going to join us today, and me and Taya Graham are going to have words after this program. But her reporting partner is joining us today. Of course, you know him on the Real News, Stephen Janis, investigative reporter and co-host of the Police Accountability Report. Stephen, thank you so much for being here.
Hey, Kim, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
We're also joined today with the core organizer of DMV Black Lives Matter. Her name is April Goggans. She is all about that action. April is an abolitionist. She's a mom, and she has been out here in the streets putting in the work to get liberation for our people. She has got all the smoke from Mayor Muriel Bowser and DC Police Chief Peter Newsham. So April, we are so honored to have you here today. Thank you so much for making the time.
Absolutely.
And we're also joined today with journalist and citizen video journalist, Chuck Modiano. I know you guys know Chuck's work. If you're on Twitter, Chuck has been in these streets all summer long, doing pretty much some of the best street interviews that really I've seen in a long time. Chuck, you're doing phenomenal work, and the work just continued up until last weekend when the Trump folks came to town. So thank you so much for being with us as well.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Wonderful. So I wanted us to start off, if we could, because I mean, what we saw in those opening clips was really just sort of like the tip of the iceberg of what happened, what transpired in Washington last weekend. April, I wanted to start with you because Friday, you know, I was following you on social media. You went live. You were doing a Periscope, and we were seeing the Trump supporters start to amass downtown. Tell me what you saw and what you experienced in Washington Friday, Saturday, Sunday. What was that like?
Organizers for Black Lives Matter DC. I want to shout them out. So, you know, what we saw was a lot of violence. We saw violence of all kinds, and all of it was targeted at Black folks. And anyone perceived to be a Black Lives Matter protester or Antifa, which is, you know, what they call everything that they don't like. So what we saw was a police department who we've been dealing with all summer, but they were in rare form. They were more violent than usual, as if that's possible. It's almost like they didn't see what any of the white supremacists were doing, no matter how violent, no matter how much property destruction, and to this day have been completely quiet about all of that. And so what we didn't see was the rubber bullets, although Mayor Bowser was able to secure, you know, $100,000 or so right before. What we didn't see was the tear gas. We didn't see flashbangs when their crowds were much bigger than ours were, right? And much more violent. So yeah, what we saw was what's typical, and that is that we are more policed, treated with more violence, and they actually, I think that the police department, Metropolitan Police Department, had a grudge. They have a grudge because we've been coming for them. They have a grudge because we're trying to defund them, and this was targeted. And yeah, you couldn't make me see it any other way.
I want us to play a video that Chuck shot over the weekend. Dwayne, I want us to go to V2 if we could, and then I want to get Chuck's reaction to what we're seeing.
Taking down the Black Lives Matter sign. Get off! Stop it! Stop it! Stop it! Stop it! Stop it! Get off him! Get off him! Get off him! Oh shit! Get off him! Get off him! Get off him! Yo, stop! He didn't do nothing! Don't touch him! Don't touch him! He didn't do nothing! He didn't do nothing! Move back! Move back! Move back! You good? You good, bro? No, stop! Stop! Yo!
Now you want to see an ally. Allies put their bodies on the line. That's what an ally does. Chuck Modiano, explain to us what we just witnessed in that video, because that shit looked hella chaotic. Did you get into a fight?
At the second part, I wouldn't say I got into a fight. I was going after someone who was being attacked on the ground, and I was trying to help protect that person and got punched along with a couple of other counter protesters in the process. So at that point in time, it was midnight, and most of the counter protesters went home. So then you see and I appreciate you saying the Klan rally. I really appreciate that. We shouldn't let white supremacists define themselves, as too many journalists do. So let me point that out. But we saw them take over the plaza. You saw the video of them ripping down the signs off a private building. I'm told that that's property destruction, property damage, and allegedly the worst crime ever, more than human lives. And yet, when we saw those people do it in front of the police did nothing, to further April's point. So a lot went on there, but I think the real story is what you and April touched upon, is that it happened with police consent. The person who was getting beat up happened with police consent. So it was crazy around midnight on Saturday.
Incredible. I mean, just stunning in the contrast in treatment, because I mean, just a couple of weeks ago, April, you were out with the family of a young man, a 20-year-old man, who lost his life, not as a result of being killed directly by Metropolitan Police, but as a result of their actions, their negligence, their ill conduct. And some officers have been disciplined for this. Tell us about this young man who tragically lost his life, and the response from the community and the family who showed up at 4th District Precinct, to let the police know that this was unjustified and tragic. But the way the family and the community supporters and activists were treated compared to what the Trump supporters were received by MPD. Talk to us about that contrast.
So when this happened with Karan, his mother and father simply wanted to get a police report, which it seems like benign. It seems like something anybody would want to do. And they got gaslighted. They got lied to. So like all of us would as parents, they got upset. And in response to them being upset, MPD decided that they were going to challenge them. They decided that they were going to treat them as hostile, just for simply being upset. Other people, of course, came out to the streets because another one of us had been killed. Harassment as well as targeting. And so the community came out and the community was upset. But the response from MPD was to make it a war zone, that they were going to show violence, they were going to be violent, and they were going to be the ones to kick it off. It was, to me, almost like a practice for a war zone they thought they were going to have for the election and the week of the election. So that's when we realized that they have different kinds of chemicals that burned worse. They had more projectiles. And this is after the city council, is trying to say that these things are illegal and that they can't use. So what you saw was just an overwhelming force of violence and trying to quell, dispel, shut down and squash any kind of resistance to the murder that they themselves had perpetuated.
Stephen, Janis, I wanted to bring you in here. You host and produce the Police Accountability Report along with Taya Graham. And all summer long, we have been seeing, let's say, groups of people in opposition to mask wearing in state capitals across the country show up at these state capitals, oftentimes armed, oftentimes disobeying the directions of police. In the case of Lansing, Michigan, where some supporters or people who were in opposition of the pandemic shutdown showed up to protest the wearing of masks, but they also made open threats to some lawmakers. But we have not seen the police respond to large groups of whites, large groups of armed whites with tear gas, with rubber bullet projectiles. The contrast in the way that armed groups are policed versus unarmed groups is not surprising, but talk to us about how this is just a long-standing pattern, and why is it the police are able to get away with this?
Well, there's two ways, we approach this on our show, because we do a lot of work on these kind of disparities in policing. And one of the concepts we talk about a lot is called social boundary policing, because really, if you look at the way American policing has evolved in cities like Baltimore and across the country and African-American cities, it has nothing to do with law enforcement or public safety. It's about policing social boundaries. Another idea we talk about is hegemonic policing, where police want to project the power of whatever, white establishment they're representing. So this is really an internalized sort of practice that really shows how American policing has been constituted and how it has responded to inequality, racial inequality, and economic inequality. So, it's not surprising when they behave this way, and it's not surprising, when the group with Kyle Rittenhouse, they throw them some water and say, "We appreciate you." Because this is really what American policing has become in many of these cities. It's really kind of been disconnected from the idea of safety, or the idea of creating some sort of relationship with the public they serve. They're really supposed to be opposed, and they're really designed to be opposed and designed to police. They understand how to police a gentrified neighborhood from a non-gentrified neighborhood. They understand how to police African-American communities, because it's been inculcated into the process, into the culture. And, it's interesting because I wanted to ask a question, because it seems like, I've been seeing the Blue Lives Matter flag show up a lot at like white supremacist type things. And so I think that is representative of the concept we're talking about, I think.
Chuck and April, let me kick that question to you. Have you seen this flag, this Blue Lives Matter flag that Maryland Governor Larry Hogan, goofy ass, stood in front of this damn flag and took a picture? But it's being used now in a different symbol. Have you seen the use of this specific flag, this symbolism used by white supremacists who have come out in the streets? Let's start with you, Chuck. Have you seen this?
Yeah, I mean, it was all over on Saturday. We kept seeing it. We kept hearing chants of back the blue by the white supremacists. So the distinction between the white supremacists and MPD who protected them is almost no distinction at all when we saw that. And when we know that there was a melee on Saturday night and a couple of individuals were actually stabbed, and there was no effort to try to find out who did it. As April mentioned, when we looked at the arrest records, almost every one of the counter protesters were Black, the vast majority, and the only white people, and there were about 2 or 3, had an incredible amount of guns and firearms on them. And that's what it would take for a white protester to get arrested. It wouldn't take simply rioting at Black Lives Matter Plaza. It wouldn't take fighting or assault. It would take you having a whole lot of firearms. So the disparity was real.
April, the friendly way that these white supremacists were received by Metropolitan Police, I know was not a surprise to you. We have seen this happen before when similar demonstrations from Proud Boys or related groups have come to the district, and, police give them fist bumps or, do little signs that they are in support of them. And this is where the whole argument for defund the police and abolish the police come from, because there's been some reporting about how white supremacists have infiltrated American policing, but that's actually a farce and a misframing of the whole situation. The white supremacists founded the police forces. They have been there the entire time. How does this also extend into the argument for abolishing the police? Because you can't eradicate the racism if the whole institution is built upon racism and enacting racist policies and making sure that they are keeping the Black and the brown folks in line.
Right. And it's interesting with the Blue Lives Matter flag, because Peter Newsham, the chief police of MPD, had to remind his officers that they're not allowed to wear it. And so it's interesting that this weekend they still had lapels or masks that said, Blue Lives Matter. And even in the clip that Chuck had, you can see police walking with them as they tore down signs. There were pictures of people in line to take pictures with the police. And you can, people can say we need to train them. We need to, discipline more. But yes, the fact of the matter is it is policing. The very foundation of policing is racist. It's racist. It had to do with protecting property. And people need to remember that at its beginning, Black people were property, right? So they're no longer protecting us as property, but still not dealing with us as human either. And they actually can't police without having someone and something to continue to police that legitimizes their existence. But what we know is they don't actually make us safer. And that's not just, an anecdote or something we wish to aspire to. We have a homicide spike here, as we do in many cities. And the fact that the police are on scene when these things happen just further let us know that we're just wasting money on something that can't do what it is we think that it needs to do. And the fact that it has enough discretion to decide that an entire group of people who come through DC with their agendas can tear down and beat people and have no kind of repercussions, because it's also indoctrinated and allowed by those who are in power and those who are elected officials here, including Muriel Bowser.
And the way that these demonstrations, white folks rioting, I don't know what to call what was going on in DC over the weekend beyond a Klan rally. That's like the best way I can surmise it, is that the Klan came to town, their grandkids came to town and showed all the way out. But there was a lot of misinformation and misrepresentation of how the events were happening and transpiring on the streets by right-wing media, claiming that Trump supporters were being beaten and assaulted left and right. But in a lot of cases, the Trump supporters themselves were the provocateurs. And I want to look at this video because the last part of this video was circulated across social media circles because it claimed that an elderly white supporter for Donald Trump got knocked out by the counter protesters. But what led up to that getting knocked the fuck out was very, very disturbing and troubling, and often omitted from some of the conservative media spin that this particular clip was given. But I want us to take a look at it. Dwayne, let's roll that.
Kill that! None of you want to fucking do that. None of you. I got some Hey, everyone. What you think? There you go. We go. That's it. Lights out. Lights out, nigga. Help, man. I'm gonna go.
Recognize an old man. What's wrong with you people? All right, brother.
Yeah, he's bleeding, man.
I don't mean to laugh, but I am going to laugh just a little bit. When racists get knocked out, that is never not funny to me. Chuck Modiano, how many similar scenes of this did you happen to see over the weekend? I mean, I know people from the DMV, we don't play that shit, right? We don't play that stupid stuff. Yeah. And if you want to come to town and talk that stuff, then you're going to get dealt with accordingly. But it did not appear by and large that it was the counter protesters inciting violence with the Trump people. It seemed to be more on the other side. How did you see it?
In DC, people strike back when they get hit. And I had a lot of people I interviewed said, this man is hitting Black women. We can't have that here. We're not going to allow that here. And to your point about the right-wing media machine, they're so selective in their clips because it was filling my Twitter timeline. I was just seeing the 18-second clip of that man being knocked out like it happened out of the blue, not the reality that he was the instigator and assaulter. We have to tell that whole story. And unfortunately, I don't believe the left-wing media has the machinery in the way the right-wing media does. That's why I appreciate you so much in covering this, because when the right-wing media have these selective edits, Dinesh D'Souza retweets it. It goes on, Tucker Carlson, it's on his show. It goes up to the president of the United States. There's an entire apparatus. But when we do the machinery, we don't have the machinery for protest here. And that's a problem.
Stephen, Janis, you've been covering police for a long time, and as a member of the media, sort of observing rather other members of the media. I mean, why is it that the mainstream media, even at the local level, are very reluctant to tell the truth about how much white supremacy and policing are intertwined? It's always framed as we have to be tough on crime, or if we have a spike in murders over the summer, oh, what are we going to get more policing, for God's sakes? How complicit is the media in this entire scenario?
Well, I mean, in my city of Baltimore, our city, they've been extremely complicit. Remember that throughout the aughts, police arrested 100,000 people a year, probably one of the most grievous violations of mass civil rights, I think, that occurred in a city like in the 21st century. And the media covered it as a crime problem, partially because I think the media tends to hew to the neoliberal credo, and partially because reporters see themselves as arms sometimes of police, in the sense that they get a lot of information from police. And when I would write stories that would not call out but expose the cruelty and the ineffectiveness of the system, I would get a lot of pressure from my editors, from the police departments themselves, threats, all sorts of stuff. I mean, it's very difficult. I think there is a huge political economy that supports policing in these communities like Baltimore. Baltimore, the police department has a $500 million budget. It's the largest, most well-funded agency in our city that is beset with poverty. And therefore, they have the majority of the power. They have a huge public relations staff full of people who do nothing but work the media all day long. So it's an extremely, insular system, which, wants to constantly distract us from the truth of its policies and how destructive they are. And I think it's extremely, I think it's incumbent upon journalists to stand up to it, but I think it's also extremely profitable for them and easier for them to simply be complicit.
Mm-hmm. April Goggans, as someone who has been on the ground during a lot of these events and demonstrations, not only this summer and this year, but obviously in previous years. And I mean, I've seen you interviewed by local media outlets. I've seen, NBC4 talk to you. How good or bad of a job, in your opinion, does the local media or even national media do in covering what we've been talking about, in the ways that police incite violence, in the ways that police are not the best stewards for public safety, and the lack of accountability there? Does the media get this wrong more often than they get it right?
You have a lot of local reporters that I don't feel necessarily do it wrong. I do feel like they don't go deep enough. And a lot of times we shoot things that they never get to air, because what actually comes down to is that editors and those folks, when you look at who they're owned by, you can understand why a lot of that happens. I want to shout out all the independent media, because I feel like, especially in DC, there is a national blackout on what actually happens here with policing. And you have people like Muriel Bowser talking about, we have the best police department ever. A best police department, number one, doesn't exist. And number two, MPD is violent as fuck. I really want us to be serious. The fact that they will not police the Proud Boys like they police my block. And that's real. But the funny thing is, the same guys that police my block were down with the Proud Boys. They're the same police that were on the bikes when I got hit with one last week. They send the cops from the hood, the cops that do the most damage, to deal with protesters, to deal with BLM protesters, right? And so what you have is an entire blackout where we can try our hardest, that you had thousands and hundreds of thousands of people down here this summer. And not any of those people said any DC names or Maryland or Virginia names of people who were murdered by police, because no one sees this as a problem here. It's the nation's capital, right? This is, somehow we skipped police brutality, but DC is still 47% Black. It's still more than 50% folks of color. And no matter where you go, the more of us there are, the more police there are, the more murders by police, the more misconduct, the more brutality, and that's real. And when you have a police chief who was confirmed despite knocking his wife's teeth out, despite being drunk with his service weapon in the street, and he was in charge of the entire IAD for 12 years. He was also the person that signed the MOU with the Department of Justice. So you have on your hands here in the District of Columbia, a chief of police that not only breaks the law, he determines who can also break the law. He gets to decide if he wants to hold accountable those who break the law, and he wrote parts of the law that make it easier for them to break.
Gentlemen, April Goggans is not here for your foolishness. I love it. Chuck Modiano, I know you guys have to go because I know you have an event coming up at 6 o'clock. Let me get your take on how MPD has been dealing with the protesters all summer long, and whether or not, you know, they have given any indication as to whether they plan on improving the way that they deal with these crowds. I mean, Washington, D.C. police pride themselves on dealing with protests, you know, over 1,000 a year. But it seems that they have reserved so much violence and scorn for the local people who are coming out in support of their communities, in support of the people who have been impacted by this violence the most.
I mean, absolutely. And we're both big April Goggans fans. And I have to mention this point that happened a couple of months ago, where April and Black Lives Matter DC were part of a group that put defund the police, painted defund the police on the street. Okay. And prior to that, defund the police was only talked about in activist circles and racial justice circles and academia, but it wasn't talked about in mainstream media. And you could chart the spike after that day, after that action, into mainstream media. And why is that relevant even to your question? Is that the police take this personally. They take it quite personally. These aren't just protesters. These are protesters who want their jobs eliminated. That's very important. And so you see a certain kind of vengeance from the police officers. You saw it in June for 2 weeks as they moved in on protesters between 2 and 3 in the morning, after media left, after you couldn't have the cameras out there, after phones were dead by the people who were intense protesting at Black Lives Matter Plaza. So that was deliberate. We saw attacks on food supporters who were only feeding the community. Their crime was feeding the homeless. They were attacks on medics. We're talking about what we call looting in any other situation where $20,000 to $25,000 was either destroyed or stolen by MPD, but we don't frame it that way. And then if you want to move to August, we're talking about the illegal practice of kettling and arresting in mass 41 people, 14 people, and keeping their phones for 3 months for surveillance practices, even though those charges get dropped the next day. So I could go on and on about the crimes of MPD, but they're war crimes and they are crimes.
Wow. Well said. Listen, April and Chuck, I know you guys have to go. April, before you leave, would you mind, we have this graphic up posted by DMV Black Lives Matter, your list of demands for the DC City Council to diminish or eliminate the influence of the police union in policing. Talk to us about this, please.
Sorry, yeah, I want to shout out Kiki, one of our core organizers who's been working really hard on this. And essentially, MPD's collective bargaining agreement is up. And when you look at what specifically is in there, there are some specific things, some specific interventions that we can make now that are harm reduction. I mean, essentially, we don't believe that police are labor. They should not have a union, period, point blank. But while they do, there needs to be, right now it's impossible to fire them pretty much. And so what we want to tell both, especially the city council, is that this year, and I'm talking to Alyssa Silverman because she is the chair of that committee, that this year they need to take serious the protection of DC residents by restricting and reducing the ways that police get to circumvent any kind of discipline. And so folks are working really hard. You're going to see more. I hope folks go to that link, sign the letter and the petition. We've got tons of people doing it. Don't let DC be lost in the news by not seeing this. We need folks to be out there and really looking.
Absolutely. Well, I know you're headed to Black Lives Matter Plaza now for a memorial. Not. Oh, I'm sorry, you're not, but my bad. But there is a Transgender Day of Remembrance event happening downtown. So I certainly appreciate you both taking the time to be with us today. April Goggans, core organizer, DMV Black Lives Matter. Chuck Modiano, citizen journalist. I'm such a fan of what the both of you do. Actually, I can't stand one more over the other. I'm a big fan of both of y'all. So I appreciate you both making the time to join us here today on Burn It Down. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So, Stephen, Janis, I held on to you, sir, because Police Accountability Report, one of, if not the best offering that we have here on the Real News Network, something that you and your partner, Taya Graham, produce and put together every single week. The latest episode of Police Accountability Report had to do with a police brutality incident that occurred in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Can you explain to us what happened?
Well, we have several stories, but basically a young woman, her name Trinity Fleming, police tried to pull her over. She drove away, led police on a high-speed chase, and eventually pulled over, got out of her car and ran and hid behind a bush. But then I guess a canine unit in that in the Fort Wayne Police Department sicked a dog on her who attacked her in the face and the neck and caused serious disfiguring of her face and serious injuries. They're going to require tremendous amount of reconstructive surgery. But I guess, as in, many police situations, the real question is why was this necessary? Number one, and why did they use a dog on a woman who had not really committed any sort of violent crime? Worst traffic violations are not pulling over. I guess about some needles in her car. But the point being that, again, we see a situation where the force of police doesn't seem to match the situation. And of course, her mother posted the pictures on Facebook, and, they got a significant amount of traffic and we saw them. And so we did an interview with her mother and, really had quite an interesting discussion because, it was another case of a person, she talked to her mother, the mother of Trinity, had been in jail and her daughter had suffered and her daughter was struggling with addiction. But of course, in this country, instead of confronting addiction, with health services or the things that people need, we tend to send police after them, and we tend to, in many states, although now no longer in Oregon, they end up in prison. So obviously, it seemed like this young woman panicked because she was struggling with addiction, and she ends up being disfigured. I mean, her ear, was like literally separated from her head. Her nose was broken. Chunks of flesh. It's very, very disturbing. But again, raising the question as to why this kind of policing and why this amount of force was used, and something, we think more about police shooting people or tasering or beating. But, there is this, and, there is a fraught history of using dogs in policing in this country that we all know about. And so, we thought it was a story worth highlighting.
Well, I have a clip from this most recent episode of Police Accountability Report where you're speaking with Trinity's mother, Jennifer Fleming. Dwayne, let's take a look at that.
The way that the dog attacked her, those were not, the dog did not attack in a way to restrain, to notify the police where she was, to stop her from running away. The dog went straight for the head and the face. The dog did not bite her anywhere but the head and the face. And so in my mind, that dog was going in for the kill. Those were kill shots. And from my understanding, dogs are supposed to, like, if she was hiding in a bush and the dog ran to the bush and found her, it should have immediately started barking to notify the police that, hey, here's the culprit, here she is. Not latch onto her face. And then the fact of the matter is like, she wasn't trying to run away. Otherwise it would have jumped up on her back and knocked her down. That wasn't happening. She was behind the bush. And she, you know, according to her, when the dog came upon her behind the bush, she immediately yelled, I surrender, get the dog, get the dog, get the dog, because she was afraid of the dog. And she said at that point in time, the dog latched onto her face, and she's still screaming. And the officer, after the dog latched onto her face, proceeded to command the dog to attack several more times. So he's instigating the dog, in my opinion. And then she said when he finally told the dog to stop attacking her, that the dog actually got more vicious with the attack, and that he had to come to get the dog off of her, and that when he grabbed the dog to get it off of her, that the dog locked its jaw, and that's when she heard the bones in her head cracking. Her word was snapping. That's when I heard the bones snapping.
You know, Steve and Janis, I know you have been covering police violence for quite some time. And, you know, in the United States, there is a hierarchy of race and gender and who receives the best treatment in general. But when young white girls are being purposely attacked with canines, you know, the situation has deteriorated and devolved to a very, very bad level. We know it's been horrible for Black and brown people for this long, but to me, her being a young white woman was really striking to me, that the police would continue to sick the dog upon her if her mother's accounting of this is correct. I mean, what are we to make of this escalation of police violence now upon everybody, right? Because it's been happening to Black and brown communities forever. But white folks are not immune to getting this kind of treatment themselves.
Well, I think one thing that we forget often when we cover these stories is that the American public has a high tolerance, I guess I would say, for police violence. That our police kill more people, you know, over a period of time and per person than most any other Western or any other country, really. We've talked about these stats in the show. I don't have them all in my head, but, you know, there were comparisons where in Australia, you know, American police killed more people in 2 months than Australia killed in 20 years. So we have this high tolerance and expectation for police violence, which I think is a lot about what we talked about before, about how a lot of policing has very little to do with law enforcement, has more to do with projecting power, both cultural and economic. And, you know, it was interesting because we reached out to Fort Wayne Police and they sent me a statement explaining it. And they said that they have, you know, over 1,000 uses of canines per year in a city like Fort Wayne, which, you know, is very odd. The city 120 miles about northeast of Indianapolis, which is very near Fort Wayne, has one of the highest incidents of dog attacks on civilians of any city in the country. So, you know, it seems like all these agencies develop their own ways of using unnecessary force. And in this case, you know, you had 1,000 uses of canine, only 5, they say, where the dog actually made contact with someone, where they actually bit them. And when I've asked them, you know, what is the criteria, they have yet to answer me. And a lot of times with these use of force, the police are not accustomed to having to answer questions about what justified. And, you know, really the truth of the matter is, as someone who's covered it for 15 or 20 years, they didn't really have to justify it until people had cell phone cameras. And so we started seeing cases like, you know, like the Jacob Blake case, for example, in Kenosha, Wisconsin, where you could see the police officer shoot him 7 times in the back, or the George Floyd, where the police officer was, you know, sitting on his neck for 9 minutes. Until we actually saw them, and we're seeing them now, it seemed like there's some pushback, but really, you know, police kill over 1,000 people a year in the US, and there's no country where it's comparable. So it's much more a part of our culture in this country. And I think very much a result of some of the historical things that you've discussed on the show and that you were discussing before about policing.
Absolutely incredible. Everyone, if you have not had the opportunity to check out this latest episode of Police Accountability Report, please go to the Real News' YouTube channel and be sure to check it out. Don't forget to like it as well. Steve and Janis, I appreciate you as always for making some time to come hang out on Burn It Down with Kim Brown. Perhaps we can get Taya Graham to join us on another day.
I hope so. She's much better than I am.
Well, I think you both are pretty darn spiffy and awesome. So I appreciate you making some time and always definitely appreciate your work. You guys kick ass. Thank you.
Thanks, Kim. We appreciate it.
All right. Gang, well, before we close out tonight's program, I just want everyone to know and be aware. This week was Transgender Awareness Week, and the Black and trans and non-binary and gay community are way more oppressed than everybody. Okay, don't ever forget that. If you think that it's hard to be Black in America, try being Black and trans in America. Try being Black and non-binary in America. Try being Black and gay in America. It's rough. You're targeted for discrimination, violence, and worse. And today is Transgender Day of Remembrance. So we want to take the time to pop up some of these tweets here, Dwayne. Take the time to remember some of the victims, people who have been murdered, people who have lost their lives to this violence. And it's so important that we remember, first and foremostly, that these people are not just numbers. This is not just a tragic statistic that we report about at the end of the year, but as so perfectly articulated by the Martha P. Johnson Institute, we are more than a number. You have to say our names. So we want to do that right now. We want to take a couple moments to remember some of the victims of violence and people who have been murdered this year, some of our Black and brown trans brothers and sisters. So I want to start off in Sikeston, Missouri. 28-year-old Nina Pop, beautiful, beautiful, beautiful young lady. From Sherwood, Arkansas, 17-year-old Brayla Stone. From Portland, Oregon, Asia Raquel Roan Spears, 32 years of age. Also from Portland, Oregon, Tele Guili, TT, 31 years old, TT. We're going to remember you, TT. 27-year-old Dominique Fells from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. From Dallas, Texas, 22-year-old Mercy Mack Ritchie. From Augusta, Georgia, 33-year-old Felicia Harris. Also from Liberty Township, Ohio, 25-year-old Raya Milton. This was a story that got some attention, not nearly enough. Tallahassee, Florida, 38-year-old Tony McDade was also murdered. And from Charlotte, North Carolina, Monica Diamond, 34 years of age. We want to take a moment to remember these victims of violence, these beautiful young men and women who have been murdered for really no other reason besides that they were trans. And so we have to keep this in mind. And this is a conversation that we are going to have here in the future on Burn It Down with Kim Brown in the very short future about why trans lives matter. I mean, and that's almost like a redundant and ridiculous thing to say. All lives matter, right? Black lives matter, but no, Black people specifically, we will never be free until our trans sisters and brothers are also free. So please, please, please keep that in mind. And we want to definitely send a remembrance out to them today. Listen, y'all, that does it. That is our program. So I want to thank everyone who took the time to tune in. Wait a second. I know we do have some comments because our fantastic producer, Genevieve Montanar, has been manning the chat. So let me read some of these comments. Thank you so much, Genevieve. The Syndicate says the state are the ones committing all of the violence. I don't think there's any dispute about that, my dear. Also from the comments, Northwest Rigging Specialist says, First Amendment auditors always get the truth recorded. First Amendment auditors will win the war with the camera and truth. That is correct. If it wasn't for people like Chuck Modiano, like Black House Media down in DC, who's been documenting all this violence from the police, yeah, the police would just be like, we don't know what y'all talking about. That shit didn't happen. Also from the comments, Northern Man says, if you're defending yourself from racism, then it isn't reverse racism. Heck, that's an interesting point to make. And lastly, here we go. James Gray says, that old guy Absolutely. Should not have been out there with those hyped up protesters. No, he could have been out there with the hyped up protesters. He shouldn't have been out there talking shit. That's why he got knocked out. You know what I mean? Like, don't go nowhere and start no static if you're not ready to take what could possibly be coming your way. Don't start violence if you don't expect violence to come back, you know, on you in the same way. But thank you all so much for the comments. I certainly appreciate it. Don't forget to go to the Burn It Down with Kim Brown YouTube channel and subscribe there. Listen, we appreciate you all taking some time to join us. Thanks to everyone that worked so hard on this show: Dwayne Gladden, Jean-Pierre Montanar, Taylor Hebden, Adam Coley, Kelly McAdams. We appreciate all your help. I'm Kim Brown. We will see y'all on Tuesday for the next edition of Burn It Down with Kim Brown. Don't forget, the COVID is still out here jumping on people. I don't want it to jump on you. Wash your hands, wear your masks, do your social distance, and try to be safe, okay? I love y'all. Mwah. See y'all. Have a great weekend.